The ground trembled beneath Vera's boots, a deep rumble she felt in her chest. From her vantage point on the rooftop, she watched as the sky shifted into an ominous shade of crimson, the color of blood. The first thunderclap shook the city to its bones, followed by a piercing wail as the massive warships breached the atmosphere, their thrusters cutting through the air with unnatural precision. "God help us," Vera muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowed as the first of the war beasts plunged from the belly of the ships, trailing fire and smoke in their wake. The city, once alive with activity, fell silent in the wake of their arrival. There was no time for fear now, only action. Her comms unit crackled to life, and she snapped to attention. "Vera, do you copy?" It was Jasper's voice, strained but steady. The engineer-turned-soldier had been her right-hand man for years. His voice was always a bit too calm for comfort, but it was what she needed right now. "I copy, Jasper." "Where are you?" "Downtown, heading toward the main barricades." "There's no sign of resistance." "They're everywhere." She could already see it, the towering war beasts, hulking creatures with scales like living armor, their eyes glowing in unnatural green. They were the result of alien genetic manipulation, bred for one thing, destruction. And now they were here, on Earth, ready to obliterate everything in their path. Vera's pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. "We'll need to move fast. We've got to delay them long enough for the last evac ships to leave. Can you activate the city's defense grid?" "I've been trying, but they've scrambled the frequencies. The grid's useless without the central relay." "It's a mess, Vera." She cursed under her breath. The central relay was located deep in the heart of the city, surrounded by alien forces. It would be a suicide mission, but what choice did they have? "I'm coming to you," Vera said, her mind already calculating the fastest route through the ruined city streets. She reached for her pack and slung it over her shoulder, tightening her grip on the weapon at her side. "We don't have much time. Meet me at the intersection near the old military depot." "Understood," Jasper replied. There was no trace of doubt in his voice, but she could hear the strain behind his words. If anyone could turn the tide, it was him, but they both knew their odds were slim. The ground shook again, and this time, it wasn't from the impact of warships. It was the heavy footfalls of the first war beast, crashing through the remnants of a nearby skyscraper. The sound was like thunder, the air thick with the stench of burning rubble. Vera didn't waste another moment. She sprinted down the staircase, her boots slamming against the concrete as she made her way to the street. The city, once full of life, was now a battleground, the sounds of distant gunfire and the shriek of alien weapons filling the air. She emerged from the building and found herself in the middle of chaos. A few of the last surviving civilians were running for cover, their faces masks of terror, but most had already been evacuated. The alien forces were methodical, slowly but surely, they were taking control. Vera's breath was shallow as she took cover behind a crumbling wall, peeking out to assess the situation. There, at the heart of the destruction, stood the war beast, a creature easily 10 meters tall, its body covered in thick, jagged armor. Its glowing eyes scanned the horizon, and for a moment, its gaze flicked in her direction. Vera froze, heart hammering in her chest. The creature paused for a beat, then turned its attention elsewhere, its monstrous form stomping forward with terrifying certainty. "Perfect," Vera muttered to herself. She pressed her back to the wall, her mind racing. She had to get to Jasper. She had no other choice. A voice crackled over her comms again. "Vera, we don't have the time. The relay's too far, and they're closing in. We need backup." She paused, calculating the risk. There was no backup coming. They were the last line of defense for Earth, and if they didn't act now, all was lost. "I'll be there in 5, she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Vera, wait," Jasper's voice cut off abruptly. But she didn't have time to listen. She darted from cover, her body low to the ground, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The street was a maze of burning debris, but she had no choice but to push forward. She was almost halfway to the depot when the first explosion erupted behind her. A cloud of smoke and fire billowed into the air, and a jagged piece of shrapnel whizzed past her, narrowly missing her arm. She didn't stop. Not yet. As she neared the intersection, her comms crackled once more. This time, it was Jasper, panic in his voice. "Vera, move, now!" The urgency in his tone was enough to propel her forward. She pushed through the wreckage, desperate to reach her friend, desperate to ensure they wouldn't be alone in the coming fight. But just as she turned the corner, she saw the worst thing she could have imagined: Jasper, pinned down, surrounded by alien forces. The glowing red eyes of the war beasts stared at her as they advanced, their towering forms looming in the distance. She was too late. The city's last hope was about to fall. Vera's pulse roared in her ears as she ducked behind a crumbling building, trying to catch her breath. Her hands trembled, but she didn't have time to stop. Jasper was still out there, and the last thing she wanted was to lose him too. The air around her was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Explosions echoed in the distance, shaking the earth beneath her. Each thud felt like a countdown, a reminder that time was slipping away. She had seconds to make a choice: go to Jasper or pull back and regroup. But the mission wasn't over yet, and every part of her screamed to push forward. She was done running. Her comms crackled again, Jasper's voice breaking through the static. "Vera, don't, please. You need to," his words cut off with a burst of static. She clenched her fists. He was in trouble. She could feel it. Without hesitation, Vera bolted from her cover, her boots pounding the pavement. Her mind flashed back to their last conversation, just hours before the war beasts arrived. They'd discussed every possibility, every outcome, except one. They never talked about failure. But now, it loomed over her like a heavy shadow. She rounded the corner, eyes scanning the streets. The devastation was beyond anything she'd imagined. Once bustling blocks now lay in ruin, entire skyscrapers reduced to rubble. A series of distant gunfire and the occasional roar of an alien war beast reverberated through the broken city. Earth had never faced an enemy like this. But then, humanity had never been up against a fight worth backing down from. Vera reached the intersection where she had seen Jasper last. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl, the unmistakable sound of a war beast nearby. She crouched down, slipping through the shadows of a burning storefront. She could just make out the silhouette of one of the creatures lumbering across the street, its glowing eyes scanning the area for movement. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The thing's massive body was covered in scales, its limbs like tree trunks with claws that could tear through steel like paper. She pressed herself flat against the debris, waiting for the beast to pass. Seconds felt like minutes. The beast's heavy footsteps reverberated in her chest, each thud a grim reminder of how little time she had left. And then, she saw him. Jasper was crouched behind an overturned vehicle a few meters away, his face pale but determined. But the look in his eyes, there was something wrong. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with a shadow of fear. He was trying to make contact with something on his wrist comm unit, his hands shaking. Vera's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't hesitate. She rushed toward him, darting between the wreckage, staying low. "Jasper," she hissed, finally reaching his side. His head snapped up, eyes wide with relief. "Vera," he whispered. "You shouldn't have come." She ignored him, pulling him to his feet. "We don't have time for this. We need to move." Jasper shook his head, his eyes frantic. "The relay. It's gone. They destroyed it. We can't stop them." Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose hope now, not when Earth's last stand depended on their survival. "What do you mean gone?" she asked, her voice tight. "They've jammed every frequency. The city's grid is down. The only thing that'll work now is the manual override at the main control center, but it's 2 miles from here." His voice cracked, barely audible over the sound of explosions in the distance. "And it's crawling with them. We're not getting through that alive." Vera's mind raced. 2 miles. It felt like a lifetime. They didn't have the luxury of time. And now, their best hope, the only hope left, was a death trap. "Then we fight," she said flatly, her eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. "We fight or we die here. But we don't give up." Jasper's face was a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. He opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off. "I'm not asking. We make it to that control center, we turn the grid back on, and we hit them where it hurts. The evac ships will have a chance to get through." He hesitated, clearly torn. But then, his shoulders slumped in resignation. "You're insane." "Insane or not, it's our only shot," Vera said, her tone hardening. "If we don't take it, everyone else is as good as dead." Jasper stared at her for a long moment, his eyes flickering with doubt. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Fine. But we'll need backup." "Backup doesn't exist anymore." Vera's voice was a cold whisper. "We're on our own." They began to move, stepping cautiously toward the alleyway that would lead them to the main thoroughfare. The streets were quieter now, the sounds of destruction muffled by the chaos all around. But that didn't mean they were safe. Jasper's face remained tense, his hands twitching nervously as he checked his weapon, a small plasma rifle that barely seemed capable of fending off a swarm of mosquitoes, let alone the deadly creatures that hunted them. Ahead, the towering shape of a war beast loomed, its eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. It was moving toward them, its steps deliberate, each one sending a tremor through the ground. Vera gritted her teeth and readied her weapon. "We move fast. No mistakes." But even as she said the words, she knew this would be a fight like no other. The night sky had fallen completely silent. Not even the distant hum of the warships could be heard now, only the oppressive weight of anticipation pressing down on Vera's shoulders. The streets lay in ruin, a labyrinth of shattered buildings and overturned vehicles. But every step she took seemed to bring her closer to the heart of the storm. Jasper was close behind, his breaths ragged, his rifle gripped tightly in both hands. His eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, always scanning for movement. They had learned to be cautious, even in the dead of night. The creatures that hunted them didn't rely on sound or sight alone, they could sense their presence through vibrations in the air, through the heat of their bodies. Vera slowed as they approached an intersection, her mind racing with strategies. They had to find a way through the streets without alerting the war beasts. The manual override they were heading for was only a few blocks away, but the route was treacherous. They'd need to move quickly, but carefully. "Stay low," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jasper nodded, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "You really think we can make it? It's getting worse out here." Vera didn't respond at first, her focus sharp as she took in their surroundings. The streetlights were dim, flickering weakly in the haze of smoke that still lingered in the air. Somewhere, deep in the distance, a war beast growled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the city. "We make it," Vera finally said, her tone unwavering. "We've come too far to stop now." Jasper glanced at her, his face strained but resolute. She could see the change in him. The man who had once hesitated in the face of danger now moved with a quiet determination, his previous doubts buried beneath the weight of their mission. The sudden crack of a distant explosion broke their moment of quiet. Vera froze, but she didn't need to look, she could hear the unmistakable sound of the war beast's massive feet pounding the earth. They were getting closer. "Time's up," Vera whispered. "We move now." They sprinted forward, their footsteps muffled by the rubble beneath them. As they reached the next alleyway, Vera signaled for Jasper to stop. She could feel the air shift, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. A war beast was close, too close. "Get behind the dumpster," she ordered. Jasper didn't hesitate. He slipped into the shadows, crouching low. Vera joined him, her back pressed against the cool, crumbling concrete of the alley. She could hear the creature's steps now, heavy and deliberate. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady. Any sudden movement would give them away. The sound grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath them. A low growl echoed from the mouth of the alley as the war beast approached. Vera gripped her weapon tighter, her body tensing in preparation. This was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or come together. Through a small crack in the dumpster, she saw the creature's massive form pass by. Its scales glittered in the dim light, its enormous, clawed feet leaving deep impressions in the street as it moved. The beast's head swung side to side, searching for prey. For what felt like an eternity, Vera didn't breathe. The war beast stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes scanning the alley. She could feel the heat emanating from its body, the air thick with the metallic scent of its breath. It was so close, she could almost hear the beat of its heart. A footstep from Jasper broke the silence. Vera's blood ran cold. "Shoo," she hissed, reaching out to grip his arm, but it was too late. The war beast turned with terrifying speed, its head jerking toward them. Its eyes locked onto theirs. The moment their gazes met, everything seemed to freeze. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech, its jagged mouth opening wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Vera didn't think, she acted. "Run," she screamed, shoving Jasper forward. They bolted down the alley, the sound of the war beast's pursuit right on their heels. The creature's roars filled the air, shaking the ground beneath them as it thundered forward. Each step it took seemed to push them closer to the edge of disaster. Vera's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the creature, not for long. They needed to find a way to turn the tables, to fight back. But they had no time, no options. The city's defenses were down, and this was their last chance to stop the alien assault. Up ahead, the outline of the control center loomed, a looming silhouette against the fiery glow of distant explosions. But it was guarded, heavily guarded. "There!" Vera shouted, pointing to an old stairwell that led to a second-story access point. Jasper didn't ask questions. They both raced for the stairs, their legs burning from the effort. Behind them, the war beast's roars were getting louder, its fury building with every step. The stairs creaked under their weight as they scrambled up. Vera reached the top first, pulling herself onto the platform and grabbing the rusty metal door. She flung it open, only to be met by a sudden burst of gunfire. She ducked, instinctively pushing Jasper behind her. "Ambush," she growled, her fingers tightening around her weapon. It wasn't over yet. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when the fight had only just begun. They were inside. And the battle for humanity's survival had entered its final phase. The air in the control room felt thick, the tension almost suffocating as Vera's heart thundered in her chest. Her hands, slick with sweat, clutched the rifle, her fingers steady on the trigger. Across the room, the war beast was closing in, its massive form moving with terrifying speed despite its size. Its beady eyes locked onto her with a predatory glare. "Vera, now!" Jasper's voice rang out over the chaos, but she didn't need to be told. In one fluid motion, she squeezed the trigger, and a brilliant pulse of plasma tore through the air, striking the beast square in its chest. It screamed, a guttural, otherworldly sound that vibrated the walls. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. The beast staggered, its hulking body reeling back as its own blood splattered across the cold floor. For just a moment, Vera thought the beast might fall, but then it charged again, a furious roar in its throat. "Vera!" Jasper shouted again, but she was already moving. She dove behind a column for cover, her breath ragged in her throat. The war beast was relentless, but so was she. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she pushed herself up, taking in the room, the control panel flickering, systems beginning to hum as the power began to return. Come on," she muttered, praying the override sequence would work. Across the room, Jasper was battling his own demons. He was at the main terminal now, frantically typing commands, trying to trigger the defense grid's activation. The war beast, seeing its prey flee, bellowed in fury and lunged toward Jasper, its claws outstretched, ready to tear him apart. Without thinking, Vera aimed once more, her pulse steady despite the chaos. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and sharp, and the beast's head snapped back. It collapsed to the ground with a resounding crash, the final scream fading into silence. Its immense form hit the floor with a deafening thud, the earth shaking beneath them. Vera's breath was shallow, her hands still gripping the rifle, but she didn't lower it just yet. She watched as the beast's massive body twitched one final time before going still. The control panel flickered again, but this time, it didn't fade. The hum of power grew louder, and then... success. The defense grid was back online. Vera exhaled, her body sagging with the weight of relief. For the first time in days, her thoughts weren't clouded by the unrelenting pressure of survival. They had done it. The grid had been reactivated. The war beasts would retreat. Jasper's voice broke through her thoughts. It's done. We've won. Vera turned to see him standing by the terminal, his face pale but lit with the glow of triumph. His hands were still trembling, but the look in his eyes was one she hadn't seen before, hope. The power was back. Earth's defense systems were up and running. The war beasts would retreat, for now. But Vera knew this victory, like all victories, came at a cost. She had lost friends. The planet had suffered. And there was still so much to do. She turned away from the console, eyes scanning the wreckage around them. The war was far from over, and this battle, though hard won, was only one step in a long, grueling journey. The enemy had already sent one wave of destruction, they could send another. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, Vera said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that crept in at the edges. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Jasper nodded. We rebuild. We fight. She could feel the weight of his words, the promise in them. Humanity had taken a hit, but they hadn't broken. They had fought back. And they would keep fighting. The war beast was gone. The grid was online. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Vera allowed herself a moment of hope. A brief respite from the storm. We will rebuild, she repeated, her gaze turning to the control room's large windows. Through the shattered glass, the night sky stretched out before her, silent and endless. But it wasn't silent here on Earth anymore. There was life. There was resistance. And for all the darkness, there was light. With one final glance at the wreckage, Vera stepped away from the console. She reached out, clasping Jasper's shoulder. Together, she said, and in that moment, it wasn't just the two of them, it was all of humanity. Standing strong.